So we would raise, and the sizing, if you remember from my chart, if you have somewhere between 25 and 50 big blinds, I recommend raising to 2.5 big blinds, which in this case is 125, right? So we raise to 125, and the small blind calls, and the big blind also calls. Okay, so this is the flop, and the small blind checks, and the big blind checks. Okay, so let's just talk about this for a second. Okay, so both blinds check. Okay, so there's sort of a convention where in general, post-flop, you usually check to the pre-flop raiser. So you're the pre-flop raiser, right? You're the one who raised the pre-flop. So the small blind and big blind usually will check to the pre-flop raiser. So why is this? So the thing is, the small blind and the big blind cannot really threaten to have a big pair on this flop. Because let's suppose the small blind had aces, right? If the small blind had aces, he probably wouldn't just call. He'd probably raise here. So same with the big blind. If the big blind had aces, he would just raise. So the point is, the small blind and the big blind can't really have aces. On the other hand, you can have aces, right? They don't have any proof that you don't have aces. You could easily have aces because you raised, and you would do that with aces. So the point is, if the small blind and big blind bet instead of checking to you, they usually leave themselves susceptible to get raised, and in general, it's not in their advantage to play a big pot because they can't really have aces while you can. So like on this board, there's just a lot more good hands that you can have instead of them. Because, you know, for them to have a good hand, they basically have to have something like pocket eights or pocket nines, which I mean obviously is a complete monster, but that's it basically for them. 9-8 or like pocket deuces. But for you, you can have all the hands I just said, plus aces, kings, queens, jacks, etc. So usually it's conventional for everyone to check to the pre-flop raiser, regardless of what cards they have. So even if I was a small blind and I had pocket eights, I would check. Even though I have a really good hand, I would still check. And the reason is because all the other times when I have a bad hand, I'm going to check. So it's kind of obvious if when I have pocket eights as the small blind, I'm going to bet. So in general, it's sort of a convention for everyone to always check to the pre-flop raiser, no matter what cards you have. So this is not a complete rule at all, but in general, this is like a convention, and in general, it's correct. There are situations where you don't want to do this, but in general, it's correct. And for the reasons I just said. So even if I had a really good hand to small blind, I would still check. If I had pocket eights, I would check. And if he bets, I would raise. So it's called check raising. I would go for the check raise. Okay, so now another thing that I see people do wrong a lot is betting too small post-flop. Okay, so usually when you're making a bet post-flop, you should bet about half the pot. So once again, it's the same sweet spot principles. So if you bet small, then your opponents can always call profitably. And if you bet big, you're risking a lot, right? Let's suppose it was this, and I bet 500 instead of 200. I'm risking a lot with no pair, right? So that's also bad. So you don't want to bet too small, you don't want to bet too big, you want to bet somewhere in the middle in the sweet spot. So it's the same principles. It's the same principles for why you don't want to bet too small or too big. And the good rule of thumb is always bet half the pot, regardless of whether it's the flop, the turn, or the river. I see too many people here bet 50 instead of 200. I see too many people just bet $50. And let's see what can happen when you bet just $50. So the thing is, if you're going to bet $50, then you're much better off just checking. Because if you bet $50, not only does the bet not accomplish much, because they have, if you bet 50 and do 375, they have 7.5 to 1 odds to call you. So it doesn't accomplish much, but even worse, it gives them a chance to check raise you. As you can see, this is what happened. Small blind and big blind both checked to me. I bet 50, and small blind suddenly made it 350. Right? I mean, it was just completely pointless to bet 50. There was no reason. If I checked, I would have seen the turn, and maybe the turn would have been an ace or a queen. So betting small basically has no purpose. You should either bet half the pot, or you should just check. Right, so basically what I said was just this slide. Betting's, yeah?
Sorry, 2 questions. The first one was, why would he check raise instead of just betting?
Okay, so Okay, yeah, so yeah, I'll go through this again. So, the reason why so the thing is when he doesn't have a good hand, he's always going to check, right? So basically, the chances that he has a good hand is much smaller than the chances that you have a good hand. Because he can only have pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 2s, or 9-8 or something like that. But you can have all those hands plus aces, kings, queens, jacks, or whatever, right? So on average, you're going to have a better hand there. And if he just bets, you can raise him and you can bluff raise him and put him in a lot of tough situations because in general, he's got to be scared of you because you're much more likely to have a good hand than he is because you're the pre-flop raiser. So basically, it's in general in his interest to check because in general, you're going to have a much better hand than him. So now if he does happen to have a good hand like pocket 8s, why should he still check? Because let's suppose he didn't. Let's suppose he bet when he had a good hand and check when he had a bad hand. Then it's kind of like transparent, right? So he's going to check everything else. So he might as well also check his good hands, and you would never expect it. Otherwise, it's kind of transparent if he's going to check all his bad hands and also check his good and bet his good hands.
Okay, that makes sense. And here's my follow-up question. From
Yeah.
experience, how relevant is it when you're trying to read your opponent's card based on his betting style? Because when you put that pocket aces, then you assume that he's playing rationally, which is not necessarily the case.
Right. So yeah. So you can try to read your opponent based on their betting size. That's another reason why I'm recommending always have the same betting size, which is bet half the pot, so that it's harder to read whether. Because yeah, some people they bet big when they have a good hand, and they bet small when they're bluffing. Then I think it's pretty easy to play against this person. Yeah.
Any thoughts on adjusting the post-flop raise for a number of callers, for a number of people that are in the pot?
Yes. So I mean that takes that into account, right? Because if there's more callers, the pot is bigger. So half the pot is a bigger number if there's more callers. Okay. So right. So you never want to bet small, right? So remember, just because they check doesn't mean they have bad hands. Usually they're always checking, regardless of what they have. So you could definitely get check raised if you bet small. So you might as well check and give yourself a chance to hit one of the 6 cards that help you, right? There's 3 aces left, 3 queens left that you could potentially have on the turn. So you might as well check and give yourself a chance to see it. In this case where you bet, you got check raised and now you basically have to fold and you just denied yourself the opportunity. So in this situation, I'd say betting 200 is an alright play and checking is an alright play as well. I think both are fine. And why is that? So let's compare the advantages of betting 200 versus the advantages of checking. So if you bet 200, if they had king jack, they would just fold. You don't give something random like king jack a chance to outdraw you. Right? If you check, the turn might come a king or a jack, and then you just let them beat you. But if you bet, their king jack will fold, which is pretty good. So that's the advantages of betting. The advantages of checking is you see the turn card for sure. There's no risk of getting check raised. And also, when you bet, so the other advantage of checking that's very important is when you bet, you're really only called by hands that beat you, right? If you bet, they're going to call you basically with any pair, which beats you, and they're going to fold like ace-10, but ace-10 is already losing to you. So when you bet, they're basically only calling you with hands that are better than yours, and they're folding all hands that are worse than yours. So in that sense, betting is sort of pointless, right? Because when you bet, you want them to either call with the worst hand or fold the better hand. But in this case, when you bet, it's the exact opposite. They're going to call all better hands, all pairs or better, and they're going to fold something like king-queen. So all in all, I think it's about comparable. There's advantages and disadvantages of each, and it's important to understand them. Okay, so now it's the exact same hand, except for instead of having ace-queen, I have king-queen. Okay? So just to make sure everyone understood the comparison, if we go through the same comparison again, what I said before is no longer true, where I said when you bet, only better hands call you, and better hands never fold. This is not true. Because in this case, if you bet with your king-queen, A hand like ace-jack or ace-7 might fold, right? If they had ace-jack or ace-7 on this flop, they don't really have much. They're probably going to fold. So betting did accomplish something. It got them to fold a better hand. Whereas before, when you had ace-queen instead of king-queen, your hand was better than ace-jack and ace-7. So it's all right if they didn't fold. So the point is, betting here is much better than betting in the previous situation. Because betting here gets to do folds of better hands, which is really good for you, right? You get to do fold of the winning hand. So it's like bluffing. So remember when I said if you had ace-queen, I think both checking and betting are fine? I think if you had king-queen, you should definitely bet to get to do fold other hands like ace-10, ace-jack. Okay. Now, what if we had queen-queen instead? So this is a very good hand. So let's go through the same chart. Advantages of betting, you don't, so it's the same thing. But now, your hand is so good that you're going to get some worse hands to call you, right? If you have pocket queens, they're probably going to call with 10-9, ace-8, pocket 5s. You get some worse hands to call you. And there's essentially no advantages of checking. So the correct play is clearly to bet 200. So this is essentially the fundamental theorem of poker, and it's sort of obvious, but just to make sure, I'm going to state it again. So what's the purpose of betting? The purpose of betting is to get them to call with the worst hand or fold a better hand, right? So basically, when you have a really good hand, you want to bet because they're going to call with weaker hands than yours and pay. Also, when you have a really bad hand, you want to bet because you're going to get them to fold a hand that's better than yours, right? So if you have king-queen in that board, you want to bet because you're going to get them to fold ace-10. If you have queen-queen, you want to bet because you're going to get them to call with 10-9. With the middle hands in your range, you should check because by betting, they fold all weaker hands and call all better hands. So there's basically no point of betting. So if you had 7-7 in this spot, I would say you should definitely check. Because basically, when you get called, 90% of the time it's going to be because they have a 9 or an 8, which beats you. And they're basically going to fold everything else. So this is sort of a very generalized principle that I want to make sure everyone understands it because this is how you should think about betting. This is the whole point of poker, the whole point of betting. When you're betting, you're either trying to get a weaker hand to call you, which is what we call value betting, or trying to get value, or you're trying to get a better hand to fold, which is what we call bluffing. And with the hands that are neither too good nor too weak, you should usually just check. So this is a very general statement, but it's definitely like basically the fundamental theorem of poker. So okay. All right. So a few more notes about betting in this spot. Don't bluff scary as hell flops, even if you have complete trash. So you know how I said if you have a really bad hand, you should always bet to try to get them to fold. But if the flop is 9-8-7, 3 hearts, they're basically never going to fold because everything's going to have some kind of flush draw or straight draw or pair or whatever. So when you have complete garbage on this board, you should just give up basically. You should just check even though you have a bad hand because yes, there's no point to bluff if the board is really scary. Another thing is don't try to bluff like 10 people. Like in this case, like there's 5 people in the hand. Even if the flop looks sort of safe, someone is going to have a 7 or have a flush draw or have like pocket 6s, and they're just not going to fold. So don't try to bluff more than 3 people. There's basically no point. Like someone's going to have a decent hand. So remember those principles. Okay. So checkpoint. What did we just learn? We learned general theory of how to bet post-flop, the purposes of betting, and how big you should be betting post-flop. Okay, so now we're going to look at calling bets post-flop. And from what I saw, too many people are calling with hands way too weak. So unless your opponent bets extremely small, which they should hopefully no longer do after today's class, you should fold most of your hands to a half-pot bet. Okay, so we're going to study a lot of hands of this situation. So everyone folds the button. So you still have 40 big blinds. You're still 40 big blinds deep. That's still your stack size, 40 big blinds, right? 2,000 when the big blind's 50. And the button's going to raise to 125. and you're going to call 75. Okay, so all the hands I'm going to describe now are the same paradigm, where the button raises, you call, and you check the flop, like I said before, where you should check to the pre-flop raise. So, and we're going to assume he bets. Okay, so in this situation, you should just fold. I've seen so many people just call in this situation, and if you have no pair and no draw, like by draw I mean a flush draw or a straight draw, which is this case. You have no pair, no draw. You should just fold. There's not really any reason to do anything. You should just fold. So I've seen a lot of people call in this situation, and you're just basically giving your chips away because you have nothing. Why would you call? So let's look at more examples where you should just fold. So next one, same situation. So I'm assuming the pre-flop play was the same. The button raises, you call, you check the flop, and the button bets. The same thing. You have ace high, but I mean the board is pretty scary, and you basically have nothing. So you should just fold. Okay, once again, fold. Even though your ace high looks decent on this board, once again, it's just there's so much stuff connects with this board. You should just, I mean, there's not really much you can do. Like when you have nothing, you should just fold. Basically, I know in the first class I gave an example of a hand where we had nothing and we raised as a bluff. I think I might have given a lot of people the wrong idea where you should just be bluffing all the time and never folding. No, you should just basically fold if you have nothing. So fold here. Like, I've been watching online, and I think the players who have done the best are basically the players who fold the most and just wait for a good hand, and then they put all their money in, and a lot of people will call them with absolutely nothing. And I think these are basically have been the people who've been doing the best in the online world, are the people who just only play good hands, and it's because people aren't folding enough. So obviously, you should just never bluff and only play good hands because people aren't folding enough. So I'm trying to teach people now to fold more. So just fold this, okay? Right. So okay. So this is another example where you should fold. So you have bottom pair, but there's so many straight draws, flush draws, straights out there. Your hand is just not good, and like you basically can't do much because there's too high risk of another card coming, or just so you should just fold. Same thing here. So here, you have 4 outs to a very good draw. If an 8 comes, you have a monster, right? You have a straight if an 8 comes. But the thing is, with only 4 cards, that's basically not good enough. Usually you need to let around like 8 or 9 cards that help you before your draw is good. So when you basically only have 1 card that can make a straight for you, we usually call that a gut shot. And in this case, I would just also fold because you're only praying for an 8 that you call. There's nothing really else going for your hand, so you should just fold. So here, you have an 8 out draw where a king gives you a straight and an 8 also gives you a straight. So that's pretty good, but I would still fold because if a king comes, he could easily have an ace, right? Players like aces. And if a king comes on the turn, even though you have a straight, an ace has a higher straight, right? So basically a king isn't necessarily a good card because there's a good chance your opponent will have an ace. And even when an 8 comes, you have a decent hand, but I mean it's kind of obvious, like it's if you're raised, it's kind of obvious out of a straight, right? Because it looks like you have a straight. So I would also fold in this situation because even if you have a good straight draw, it's just kind of transparent on this board. So okay, this is another example where I would fold. So you called with pocket 5s, and the board comes Queen Jack 10. There's not really much you can do. Sure, you have a pair, but any other hand can. It's easy for him to also have a pair, or even if he doesn't, if he's got a king, he's got a ton of outs, right? He can hit a 9 or an ace or a king and beat you. So you basically did nothing. You just fold. Okay, so I just went through a lot of examples of where I see people call, where you should definitely be folding. So now you might ask me, okay, in these fold spots, what if I think bluff raising more? What if I raise instead? Okay, so this is an important point. The point of bluffing isn't to take a garbage hand, and you don't want to bluff with garbage hands. You want to bluff when you have some kind of outs, when you have some kind of draw, basically, like if you have a flush draw or something. So I'm going to talk more about this next class, but for now, just fold in all these spots. So I'm going to quickly scroll through them again. And another thing to note about all these examples I just gave is notice that in every situation, my hand pre-flop is not that bad. Like, really in this situation, if you had something like 7-6 offsuit, you should just be folding pre-flop. You need a decent hand to call pre-flop in the first place. And all the examples I gave of my hand are decent enough hands to call pre-flop. But anything much worse, I would probably just fold. So Queen 9 suited, I would call. Ace 9 offsuit, I would call. 7-9 suited, I would call. But yeah, all these flops I would fold. So pocket 5s I would call. But all these flops I would fold because you just have nothing. Okay, so I gave you some examples of boards where you just have nothing. So people need to be folding more often in general. Like, if I were to go online and play right now, I would just I would never bluff. I would only play good hands and just bet a lot when I have a good hand. And I know people will call me because people aren't folding enough. So I'm telling you, you really need to be folding in all of these situations I just described. Okay, now let's look at some situations where our hand is good enough to call. So here I would call, because here I have ace 9, even though I only have ace 9 high, the flop is extremely safe in this case, where there's not really much he can have on it. So remember on the last case where I said you should fold ace 9 high, the board was king jack 8, or like 6-5-4. There's a lot more going on those flops than 7-3-3, right? Because if there's 2 3s out there, the chances that he has a 3 are very low. So essentially there's only one relevant card, which is a 7. So ace 9 high is a lot better here. Okay, I would call something like this. You have bottom pair on a pretty safe board. I would call that, right? Before I said you should fold bottom pair, where you had ace 9 on queen of hearts, jack of hearts, 9 of hearts. This is a really bad situation for you. But in this case where you have a small pair, it's a lot better because there's no risk of a heart coming and just ruining the hand for you or something like that. So I would call here. Okay, I would call something like here. Even though the board is scary, you have a good pair. So I would call here. I would also call here. So I have king queen on ace king 6. I would also call in a situation like this. So I'm going through this fairly quickly. So even in this situation, I would call. So the point of these, obviously these are good hands. Obviously I'm calling. But the point of the last couple of examples is you shouldn't be raising. Like your hand is not good enough to raise in any of these situations. And I've seen a lot of people raise and put other money in these situations where your hand just isn't that good. It's definitely pretty good and good enough to call, but not good enough to raise and put all your money in. So in this, so the important thing to take away from these examples isn't that you should be calling. It's that obviously you should be calling because you have a pretty good hand. But the point is you shouldn't be raising. Your hand is not good enough to raise. Okay, so call here with second pair. So when I say second pair, I mean, so usually you call the top pair, second pair, bottom pair, or top pair, middle pair, bottom pair. Where top pair means the highest pair possible. Second pair means the king, pair of kings, and bottom pair means a pair of 6s. Okay. So the point is, none of these cases is your hand really good enough to raise. So that's an important takeaway. Even in this case, when you have top pair, if your other card is too small, like a 6, it's just too easy to lose to like ace 10 or ace queen or something. So in all of these situations, I would call. Even in a situation like this, where I have top pair, and I have the best possible kicker, right? I have the top pair jack with an ace kicker. It's still kind of scary that I usually would still only call because on a jack 10-9 flop, they can just have jack 10, 10-9, jack 9, 8-7, queen 8, king queen. A lot of hands that beat you because there's straights and stuff like that. So I would still just call. So even on a board like this, I would still just call if I had pocket 6s because there's not much you get paid off by if you raise. That's worse, and they can easily have a bigger pair. So yeah, so the point is these calling hands are obviously pretty good, but none of them are really good enough to raise. So, okay, I don't think I'm going to scroll through them again. So the thing is, if you raise, you give the button an opportunity to re-raise all in, and you either have to fold a good hand or call and have your hand not be good enough, both of which are terrible situations. So the purpose of calling instead of raising one of these medium strength hands is you keep this pot size under control. So another note is, with these call hands, when you call the flop, if he proceeds to bet the turn and bet the river, assuming your hand doesn't get any better, you should probably fold by the river. And I see a lot of people just call and call and call and call and call, and then you never fold, even though your opponent keeps betting, telling you that they have a good hand. So let's say this example, right? So I'm saying you should call the flop, and let's say the turn is just a range like a deuce, something that's very irrelevant, a deuce of hearts, and you check and he bets again, and you call again, and then the river, let's say, is another deuce, and you check again and he bets again, and then you call again. And I see a lot of people do this. So if your hand isn't good enough to raise on the flop, it probably isn't good enough to call the turn and call the river if they keep betting, right? If your opponent bets the flop, bets the turn, bets the river, then your second pair is probably not good enough. So all the hands that I said you should just call, you should call the flop, and you should fold by the river if your opponent bets the flop, bets the turn, bets the river, because your opponent probably has a better hand than you if they bet all 3 times. So I'm just trying to give people an idea of how good certain hands are in certain spots, and whether it's worth raising or calling. Or okay, so now just how good does my hand have to be raised? So all these examples, like I said, in general, people are putting in too much money with bad hands. And so you're asking me, okay, all these hands seem like good hands, but they're not good enough to raise. So how good does my hand have to be? And the reasonable rule of thumb is you should have 2 pair or better. So, okay, so this does not count as 2 pair, right? So when I say 2 pair or better, I mean like where both of your cards pair to the board. So because in this case, even though you have 2 pair, if they have pocket 8s, they have a better 2 pair. So, and obviously, you need to take what I said with a grain of salt, right? So if you have 9-7 here, this is not a very good hand because any heart beats it, right? So you shouldn't go all in with 9-7 when there's 4 hearts. Like similarly here, this is not a very good 2 pair because any 4 or any 9 beats you, or any 2 hearts beats you. Okay, so now let's look at some situations where you actually can raise. So let's look at some hands that are actually good. Okay, so this is about as good a situation as you can get when you have a small pair and you hit a third of your small pair. So usually we call such hands sets. Usually that's a term. I know a million different things are also called sets, but usually we call these things sets. So this is actually a good hand. Okay, so before, all the examples of the calling hands I showed you are not good hands. You shouldn't be putting in all your money. I mean, you can call and win the pot sometimes, but I'm talking about hands that are worth all your money. And this is a hand that's worth all your money. Like, this is just a complete monster hand, right? So you're only losing your pocket 8s and pocket 10s. You're beating everything else. You're beating 10-8. You're beating pocket aces. You're beating everything else. So this is a very good situation. And it's even better because there's a good chance that your opponent will have a 10 or something, right? So, because if you have pocket 10s, even though that's a better hand, it's harder for you to get money from your opponent because you already have 2 of the 10s out there. It's hard for your opponent to have a 10. But in this case, when you have bottom set, so this is why, so this hand we call bottom set. And usually bottom set is a very, very good situation. And because you have a really good hand, and it's also likely for your opponent to have a good hand that's worse than yours. Okay, so here if you have 3 of a kind like this, it's a lot worse, but you still have a good enough hand that I would raise and put all your money in. In this specific situation, I think just calling is okay as part of like a trap, because by raising, it looks kind of like you have an ace because there's not much else you can have when you raise. So it's kind of makes your hand obvious if you raise. And also you're not really scared of too many turn cards that could come. So I think just calling here is also alright. But definitely in this situation, I would be willing to put all my money in. So with 3 of a kinds, you can put all your money in basically. Okay, so in this situation, obviously I have the best possible hand. I'm willing to put all my money in. Once again, in this situation, I wouldn't mind just calling. calling because you're really not afraid of many turn cards and you can kind of trick your opponent. Okay, but in this situation, I would definitely raise. And the reason is because in this situation, you're a lot worse off than in the first situation, right? In the first situation, you're not really afraid of a fourth heart coming. But in this situation, if a fourth heart comes, your hand is suddenly not very good. I mean, it's still pretty good, but it's not nowhere near as good as it was. Like if the turn is, say, the deuce of hearts, then any heart higher than a 6 will beat you, right? So there's a lot of turn cards that you're scared of. So you would definitely want to raise in this situation and get your money in now instead of letting another heart come and ruin your hand. So same thing in this situation. I would definitely raise and get it in when I have a straight here instead of letting a diamond come and ruin my hand or something. So yeah, so here I'm trying to give you actually examples of strong hands. So here, here with 2 pair, I would be willing to raise and put on my money. But yeah, so the situations I just described are actually good hands. The situations before are decent hands, but they're definitely not worth all your money. So I recommend everyone you look through the slides that I posted today and just look. It won't take you very long. It'll take you 5 minutes. Just flip through all of the hands again and make sure you sort of get an idea of what hands you should just fold, which hands are trash you should just fold, which hands are good enough to call but not good enough to raise and put all your money in, and which hands are good enough to put all your money in. And the point is, for a hand to be worth all your money, it's got to be very good. And like people have in general been putting all their money in with hands that are not good enough. So usually you need 2 pair or better. Like, all of these hands, you need a really good hand basically. Okay, so I'm going to show you some other examples where you have a really good hand, and even though if you don't have 2 pair, I would still put all your money in. So let's suppose you decided to be tricky and not re-raise your pocket aces pre-flop. I think putting all your money in on this flop is fine because there's just nothing much that beats you, and you can have like pocket 8s or something. In this situation, I think your hand is good enough to put all your money in. You only have 1 pair, but the flop is relatively safe compared to the Jack 10-9 flop I showed you earlier. So earlier I showed you this flop where I said I wouldn't be willing to put all my money in, but this flop is a lot safer because there's less straights, and he's also less likely to have 2 pair, right? Because he's probably not raising deuce 7, so he's probably not going to have 2 pair with 2s and 7s. Or in the previous case, it's more likely he'll have 2 pair. So I think raising here is okay. I think raising here is okay, where you have a good pair plus a flush draw, plus a good flush draw, I guess. That's also fine because you have top pair and a flush draw. So these are examples of some 1 pair hands that are good enough to put all your money in, I'd say. Okay, so now the thing is, okay, so one thing that I sort of forgot to mention, that I didn't mention through all this, that is very important, is how good your hand needs to be is very dependent on how many number of big blinds you have, right? So everything is dependent on how many big blinds you have. And that's what I said in the first lecture as well. So in all these examples, I assumed you had 40 big blinds. But if you have fewer than 40 big blinds, then you can put all your money in with a lot weaker of a hand, right? Because you're risking less. So let's say you only have 1250 instead of 2,000 chips. Okay, so before we started with 2,000 chips. Now I'm going to assume you only started with 1250, so you only have about 25 big blinds. So it's still the same situation. The button raises and you call. So why did the button raise to 100 instead of 125? So it's because of the chart, right? Because now remember the chart. If you have 25 big blinds or less, you should only raise to 2 times, right? So the raise size gets smaller as your number of chips gets smaller. Okay, so in this situation, even though I only have top pair with not that good a kicker, I would be willing to put all my money in because I just didn't start with that much money in the first place. So I'm risking a lot less. So when you have less big blinds, you can put your money in with a lot weaker hands. So same with this. If I have ace-7 here, I would be willing to put all my money in because the number of big blinds you started with is a lot less. Okay. Right, so same thing again here. Even though before when I had this example, I said I wouldn't put all my money in, but in this situation, I would definitely put all my money in. So, right, so if your number of big blinds is a lot less, you can put your money in with a lot weaker of a hand. So on the contrary, if the number of big blinds is a lot more, I would be more cautious. So like, let's say we had this hand where we started with 8,000 chips instead of 2,000 chips. Right, so 8,000 chips, that I would not put in all my money for 8,000 chips with 6-5 cards on this spot. So the general principle applies where, right, it's the same principle. If you have more chips, you need a better hand to put all your money into because you're risking more. And if you have fewer chips, you don't need as good a hand to put all your money in because you're risking less. So all the examples I gave you are examples where you have 40 big blinds. So hopefully you can just extrapolate a bit from there. I mean, I'm going to give more example hands in future classes, but hopefully you can do some extrapolation of, you know how good my hand has to be when I only have 25 big blinds, how good my hand has to be when I have 100 big blinds. But the examples I gave were 40, and I think that's a good number because I think on average, most of the hands who play in the online league, you end up having around 40 big blinds. Yeah?
Bring the slide, when you say raise, you mean all in?
Sorry, oh, raise? No, sorry, I don't mean all in. Okay, that's a very good point. In all these slides where I said raise, I mean raise to like 2.5 times his bet or something like that. Right, so yeah, you have too many chips to go all in. So it's sort of the same sizing rules again. It's sort of the same escaping rule stuff. So you know, if I had only like 600 chips, I would go all in. But 2,000 is just enough that you don't have to raise and put all your money in. So are there any other questions about all these hands? So yeah, I hope you look through these examples and sort of just keep them at the back of your mind of how good. Yeah.
On a game like this, where really the CPUs vote, do you usually raise min-raise, or do you still go 2.5? When you're trying to, like, you say between basic call your raise?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Yeah, so I mean, in this case where your hand is just exceptionally strong, when you raise, you can raise a bit small, right? Because what's the disadvantage of raising small? The problem with raising small is your opponent has really good odds to call, right? It's the same thing we've been going through over and over again. The disadvantage of raising small is your opponent can call and have really good odds. But in this case, they actually have very few outs. I mean, if they don't already have 2 pair or better, then they have 0 outs on the turn, right? So you're less afraid of giving them good odds. So yeah, so that's a very important point that I'll talk more about in future classes. It's a more advanced point. But if your hand is so strong and your opponent just has no outs anyway, then it's all right if you give them 10 to 1 odds because you're not afraid of anything. So in this case, that's fine. But like in this case, it's definitely not fine because if they have any heart, then they've got like 8 or 9 outs. And same with this case, that's definitely not fine. But yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, so next class we're going to talk more about bluffing. So this class I mostly only talked about good hands and how good your hand needs to be to get all your money in. Next class I'm going to talk more about bluffing and draws and wide odds versus wide odds. So one last thing I wanted to say was just dealing with boredom. So once again, like I said, people are playing too high a percentage of hands. So what I recommend is you chat with people about the hands at your table. So I saw a lot of people talking and having a good time. That was good. I think people should do more of that. Or you can multi-table. I sent an email about playing cash games at the same time as your tournaments. Or you multitask, or you read the slides while you play. But if you get bored easily, do something while you're playing poker. Don't play a bad hand and gamble with a bad hand just because you're bored. So even though we're not playing for real money, you should try to take this seriously, because I assume you're in this class because you want to learn how to play poker, right? So you should practice and try to take this seriously. Don't throw your money around because you're bored, because it's not real money. So yeah, so I highly encourage people to chat about the hands, talk about the hands, and stuff like that, and that way you don't get bored and play too many hands. Because right now, it seems like people are just bored with one or too many hands. So yeah, so I'm going to announce the exact prizes later, but there will be some prizes for people who have a high point poker game. So just to discourage people from playing every tournament, going all in every hand and just playing randomly. So yeah, so I hope people, every tournament you play, you should be trying your hardest, not just being bored. Okay, well, thanks.